What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Meet Me Nation podcast. I'm here with Jeremy and Daniel. Boys, how y'all doing today?
Fantastic.
Doing well, man. Doing well.
Well, big week coming off the win against UNT, which is huge because that's kind of becoming a budding rivalry for UTSA. So to be able to come out and get that win is massive. That makes us one win away from being bowl eligible, which I think after our start of the season, I don't know if anyone would have really called that. I would like to say I did call that from the beginning, that there was still a possibility. It's everything's looking good for UTSA, especially now. Last home game this coming weekend, or this coming Friday, I guess, against Temple. I mean, everything's looking like it's trending in the right direction for UTSA.
Yeah, I feel like this felt a little personal. You think about the team, what they're used to, but more importantly, you think about Jeff Traylor and his record, not just here, but anywhere he's been. And even, zoom into his time here. Hasn't missed a bowl. I think this would kind of shake everybody's confidence. I think he knows that. And I think it's below his standard to miss a bowl at least. I think you could point to the onside kick itself. I think he has a lot of respect for the admin and the faculty on that team, but there was kind of a personal feeling with having that kind of foot on the throat kind of approach, taking an onside kick so early. That's the energy I got from his take on the game.
Yeah, I think the energy overall. I mean, one of the things that I've always respected Traylor is that he always mentions this during his press conferences, but he says, when a player makes a mistake, they throw an interception, they drop a pass, whatever it might be. He says, like, the player didn't mean to do that. They're not purposely trying to sabotage the team. They made an error. And so he's the kind of coach that a lot of coaches, if a player, particularly right now where we're sort of in a rebuilding season, we've got a lot of new guys like Owen and whatnot coming in, replacing, key players that we had in the past 4 years. It'd be really easy for coaches to come in and just like take people out, keep like having this roundabout carousel of new players coming in and out. And I think Traylor's really, really done a good job of trying to instill confidence in his players. And I think that's especially true for Owen. You see that right now a lot. I remember back pre-Traylor era, back even the Coker era, you had a lot of this sort of stuff where, players would, the former players would leave, and, QB position especially was a big one when Souza left. We kept rotating through new QBs, never letting them really build up that confidence. And with Owen, I know, earlier this year, you're playing Texas, you're playing a pretty hard schedule. It's kind of understandable to expect him to struggle, but Traylor, really kind of just kept him in there, kept a lot of these players in there, helped them build their confidence. And I think we're kind of seeing that fruition of that coming into play now, where UTSA has been winning the past few games. I think right now in the Alamodome, I don't know exactly what Traylor's record is, but I think he's only lost 2 or 3 games in the Alamodome so far. Yeah, 3 games. And so that's an incredible record. Obviously, the Alamodome, the crowd that comes in is partly to laud for that as well. But overall, I think we're in a really good place. And again, I feel like, even with a bowl game, which I think we should get if we beat Temple or when we beat Temple, I think, this is sort of a rebuilding year, but looking really, really good going into next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I've noticed in the last, call it 3 games, kind of since the Tulsa game, Owen has definitely shown the confidence in the player that we were expecting at the beginning. But I think everyone knew it was there. It was just a matter of when he was going to have that confidence breakthrough. Because, again, when you're coming out, your first time I don't know if it's first year starting, but first year starting here, coming out, I think he had some nerves, just like everyone would. And there was a big expectation on this UTSA football team. And I think now they found their stride. And like I said, Owen just has looked absolutely amazing. Like, I think even my dad has said at the last 3 games, like, we found our quarterback. Like, I don't think anyone's questioning that anymore. I know there was definitely some questions to start the year, but after what I've seen, I don't think I've seen someone with such good arm talent. Like, that dude can throw the ball so well, and he spins the ball so well. Like, it's one of those things that you look at and you're like, this dude can play football. And even last against UNT, he could have had 2 bombs that were just dropped. But, I mean, they were placed perfectly. And you just watch him, his confidence, his decision-making has become so much better. Like, he's pulling the ball to run. He's throwing where he needs to throw it. And then another big thing that I've noticed is the tight ends have really stepped up. Like, I mean, whenever you're out, you're basically your 2 best receivers with JT and Devin. They needed to rely on the tight ends massively, and they've done that. And the tight ends have stepped up, all 3 of them. And then you look at Chris as well. I mean, Chris has been a big part of this offense this year. Like with him basically becoming the number one wide receiver for this team, he had to step up big time, and he's done that.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, if you guys know, I believe Owen started his first game with us last year against Tennessee, right?
Yeah, he came in the second half.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, dude, like to start your game with that in that environment, that's insane. And so I'm sure, there's a level of confidence there where you're kind of like, dang, dude, do I have what it takes? And I think, like you've seen the past few games, he's finally getting the confidence. And from what I've seen on Twitter, like the players absolutely love him. The people in the locker room absolutely love him. And so that's huge as well. But I think losing Wisdom, losing, obviously Harris, you didn't have that leadership maybe as present, and having him now come into that confidence level, I think is paying big dividends now.
Adding on top of that, I think it's important to note that not only did he start Tennessee, right? He was the only quarterback to score that game. Mm-hmm. Obviously wasn't the starter last year, but he was the quarterback to win us our first bowl. So a lot to be expected. I think that was kind of the big disappointment, and it wasn't on him as far as what's gone down this year. Obviously, O-line issues have been a thing. Just to kind of add on what I liked from the game, it's obvious that we're trying to get around these O-line issues, and you can point that to the receiving yards that Henry's been seeing. If the O-line can't make that hole, just pass it to him, throw over the O-line, and get it to him to make a play.
I mean, you look at the game stats from UNC. I mean, 308, call it 80 passing yards is just ridiculous. And then not only that, I think that's the most rushing yards we've had all season by a long shot. Like that's a huge increase in the run game, which was massive for UTSA. Again, when they have the run game, their offense flows a lot better. And then even looking at, there were still 8 penalties, but they limited the amount of penalties they were giving, the amount of free yards that they were giving, which is huge. And then you dominate the time of possession. They dominated the time of possession by 19 minutes. Like that's a huge thing for UTSA. And then you even look at it, Owen had 2 big runs that he pulled off because he made the decision to pull it and run. And that was, like I said, I think that goes into the confidence of his decision-making has gone through the roof compared to the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I think coming into this, I was expecting a shootout. I think a lot of people were too. I think that time of possession obviously is something that coach is really good at doing. But even if it had been a shootout, I think that would have been the difference maker to still get us that dub. Yeah. I know me personally, I sorely underestimated the defense. I had called the offense right. I had called UTSA score right. I think last episode 48-45 was my estimate, but that's on me. I have to give my apologies to the defense for just underestimating what they went ahead and did that night.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Tate Sandell as well kicking. I know UNT for the UNT game, we had to go for a lot of those field goals, and he's running right now like 81.3% for the field goal completion range. And I think the only game that he hasn't been at 100% was versus Memphis. So he's been really, helping us there. I know special teams was a big worry earlier in the year, and having that along with Owen, who, if he does end up becoming like a dual threat QB like Frank Harris was, like, dude, we're in a really, really good place going into next year.
Yeah, and I think even looking at it, like you look at Owen, and I'm not saying he's gonna end up like Frank Harris, because again, I think Frank Harris was just kind of a different breed of quarterback. But I think when you have someone who can run it when needed, is huge. I think that in college football nowadays, you have to have that. Like you look at a lot of the really good teams, they have that guy that will pull it and run it when he needs to. And then on top of that, you look at it, you only have 1 turnover last week, which is huge. And UTSA forcing 2 turnovers, which is big again. Their defense looked amazing for that game. I think the defense held their ground, and I was very impressed, especially just the last 2 weeks with UTSA because after the bye week, you're coming in and you're going to have to play Memphis, UNT, and Army to finish the season off 3 of your last 4 games. And so to see that and UTSA be able to come out and win 2 of those games against very tough conference opponents was a really, really big thing for them. Coming off a big week against UNT, I think that's huge for the confidence. And then knowing that all you have to do is go in and beat Temple, and that allows you to be bowl eligible. I don't think a lot of UTSA fans, especially after losing to Tulsa the way we did, would have seen a bowl game coming. Like, I don't think any UTSA fan was going to see that. And so I think for them to come out and do what they've done the last 2 games and give themselves a chance to be bowl eligible going into the last 2 games is something that I think any UTSA fan would have taken. Like, I don't think anyone would have complained if you said, hey, we have 2 games left to win one to be bowl eligible.
No, and I'm definitely guilty of underestimating the outcome after Tulsa. I think that was kind of the path was, beat Tulsa, possibly lose to Memphis, take UNT maybe in Temple, and Tulsa kind of made that a tall order. But of course, as we know, they delivered against Memphis, and here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those losses against Texas State and Rice definitely played a huge hit on like our team's ego and confidence. I'm sure with Owen as well, because those are games that you're expecting essentially to be a guaranteed win. So to be able to kind of get where we are right now, essentially have a bowl game, and then hopefully be in a good place mentally against an Army. I'm not gonna say we're gonna beat Army right now, but to at least be in a position to compete, I think is huge.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the biggest thing I'm seeing glimpses of the last 2 years Roadrunners that we haven't seen in a little while this season, like pulling out the onside kick, the stomp on their throat mentality, like coming out and punching UNT in the mouth right away. I think that was a massive thing for them to do, because again, when you get down in a game, it's a lot harder to crawl back. But whenever you come out and punch them in the mouth and go up 14-0 and then pull out the onside kick, like I think that was something I was like, whoa. Now I'm seeing glimpses of the confidence that I've seen in previous years.
Yeah, and part of that I think might be maybe coach compensating for some of the bad things we've seen these last couple of weeks, right? I mean, losing steam against Memphis, choking against Tulsa. I think he understands that to kind of avoid that, there's always that kind of that unknown factor in the second half. The best thing to do is to overcompensate and start fast and just create as big as a gap as you can.
Yeah, the crush the throat mentality is something I think we really have, because even against UNT, like as well as we played, UNT at the end of the day, they were still able, like in the first quarter or the first half rather, they only scored 1 touchdown. And going into the second quarter, they started to kind of pull away a little bit. They had I believe 4 touchdowns total, and so that's something where we're still sort of struggling. Where it seems like we do really well the first half, second half we're either letting off the brakes or they're figuring out whatever our scheme is. And so we can't really afford that, especially obviously when you go into Army. But, when we go into Temple, that's really going to be our biggest chance of getting the bowl game. We've got to just have that mentality of the dude, just go all gas, no brakes, not to copyright Texas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest thing when you look. I mean, I see it in a lot of college football, not just with UTSA, but college football all over, is teams will come out to a big lead in the first half and then play protective in the second half, try not to make a mistake instead of doing the exact same thing they were doing in the first half. And I think that's a problem in college football in general, because teams are so scared of losing that they try to come out and prevent that instead of attacking more. And I think that's I think it's a bad ideology to fall into. I think when you come into a game and you come up with a lead like that at halftime, you want to go out and stomp on their throats, just finish the game off. Like don't even give them a chance to breathe, because I think that's the biggest thing that I think a lot of college football teams struggle with, is just not letting up. And then, I mean, you kind of look at going into this week on Friday, you got Temple, who is maybe not one of the best teams in the AAC, especially not after the last 2 games we played. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if they are able to keep that same intensity, because again, it's not that 7-1 Memphis team that you want to beat and knock out of conference championship contention. It's not North Texas, who's becoming a rivalry for us. So you don't have that same intensity going into that game. I'm interested to see if they're able to keep that same intensity they had against UNT and Memphis against Temple.
I'm hoping so, man. It's the last home game. If you guys are in San Antonio, you guys are listening, definitely come out, show the team support. Temple's in a really rough place right now. They just fired Stan Drayton, the head coach. I believe he was like 9-25 in the past 3 years for the Owls. And so Temple is definitely going to be trying to figure out where they need to be. And if there was ever a game for us to get in the shot of the bowl game, it'll be against Temple in the Alamodome.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at it on Twitter today, actually. So there's only 2 teams that are undefeated at home and haven't won a game on the road, and it's UTSA and Washington. I found that a very, very interesting stat to see that UTSA is 5-0 at home, but 0-5 on the road.
I'm telling you, man. Alamodome has some sort of like magic properties, dude.
Yeah, it's been like that for. I mean, since Traylor has come, it's like you said, he only lost like 3 games at home, and so it's really interesting to see how good they are at home, but they seem to struggle on the road. And I'd be interested to know if it's something that has to do with the dome itself, like playing inside, not really having to worry about the elements. Like, I'd be interested to know kind of what's the difference.
I've always had a theory that we struggle with the sunlight. I think if you were to really think, and I was thinking about it today, you think back in Traylor's first year, we lost to FAU. That was like 11 a.m. I mean, just think of any bad loss. The sun was out, and you think about games that we clutched, Illinois, nighttime. I mean, if you just really think about it, I mean, a lot of the specific games are kind of missing me right now. But I mean, some of our bowls as well. The one in Florida was during the day. That first one that was on ABC, that was during the day. Sunlight was out. I mean, I think there's a pattern there.
Yeah, it'd be a really interesting theory to kind of figure out, like, because UTSA is so good at home. Like, they are so good at home. And so it's one of those things that's just really interesting. And I think it works out perfectly that 3 of our last 4 games are at home. I think that's a nice way to finish the season. Granted, our last game's on the road against Army, but also I think I've said this before. You look at the Army UTSA series, no one's ever won at home. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there is a chance. There is a chance that UTSA can beat Army at Army, which I think that'd be something, especially if they're bowl eligible, to go in and you're like, all right, now we're just playing to ruin Army season. I think that's a fun way to look at going into a game, you know?
Which is why I'm rooting for Army until we play them, just so they keep that ranking, just to make that a little sweeter.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like I said, I love the confidence that they're showing. I love seeing the way they're playing football. Like, again, it's giving me flashes back to the last few years, like, to see the confidence they're playing with. I mean, to see the offense put up almost 700 yards of total offense against UNT is insane. Like, that's a stupid amount of total yards from the offense. So I love seeing it. It makes you, with all the sadness that we've had this year, to see these last 2 games go the way they have has been a very nice, I don't know what you'd call it, like a breath of fresh air in a sense, to kind of see, hey, there's that old team is still there. And like, I think the biggest thing that I've seen is to see the offensive line step up the way they have. Like, we were talking about a lot of injuries and things like that. And so to be able to see the offensive line come together and be able to put up 2 games like that, I think is huge. And even last game, there was, I think, one or 2 offensive line injuries again last game against UNT. And for those guys that are 3rd and 4th stringers to step in and be able to just step up and say, hey, I'm the guy now, I got to do my thing. To be able to step up and do that is huge.
Dude, that's huge, because I don't think a lot of people really are taking that into account, myself included, is how heavily injured our team has been most of this year. And, you know, the place where we've been able to be. I mean, I've been a UTSA fan since 2013. I was a student in 2013. And I remember there's like days, it was so bad. Things were so bad. And I think earlier this year, you know, getting kind of PTSD of like, dude, is this it? Is the golden run over? And now with the way we're playing with Owen at the helm, and especially with Traylor still willing to stick around, dude, things look so good going forward.
Yeah. No, it's true. And I think it was like against UNT, I was looking at, there was a graphic, and there was like 20, like I think right around 20 guys that were out with season-ending injuries this year for UTSA. Yeah. I mean, that's something you're just like that's 20 guys that are out with season-ending injuries. Like, that's a lot of holes to fill. And to be able to see that graphic and to be able to see what UTSA has been able to do with such a banged-up roster is huge. And like you said, Amador just came back, I think last week against UNT?
Yep.
And then he got hurt during that game and came back in and was able to play. And I love him as a slot receiver. Like, I've been watching him play last year and this year. Like, that dude is so fast. And to be able to see him in the slot, and then you have Chris doing his thing, I think it's really nice to see the UTSA offense kind of falling into their own and being able to find their rhythm and their identity. I think that's the biggest thing, is they found their identity that they were searching for the first 6 games, whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, and again, huge shout out again to Owen. Like, the really cool stat was, like, you know, the first 23 passes he had, basically 20 out of the first 23 he made them, and those last 3 basically were just sort of drop passes. And so the guy was just killing it. And that's not to mention how much rushing yardage he had. I mean, it was just like, there were people on Twitter talking about, oh, it's like a second coming of Frank Harris again.
Yeah. No, and to see things like that, it just makes you – it's one of those things that you just feel this sense of like, there's just like a breath where you're like, okay, now we're back to where we were. I'm not saying we're gonna go and win those last 2 games and win a bowl. Like, I mean, I think just to see the progress that they've had this year gives me so much hope for next year. Like, to kind of have Owen now has a year under his belt. We get a lot of those guys that are injured back. Like, I think there's a lot of good things in the works for UTSA coming into next year.
My mindset, man, is that if we beat Temple, like if we lose to Temple, that's going to be a big issue. But if we beat Temple, even if we lose to Army, even if we lose our bowl game, I consider this like a win for the year going to next year.
100%. It's like we said. When you look at what you'd say UTSA, what did UTSA start out? 2 and 2. I think is what it was.
Yeah, we lost to Tech, one against Kennesaw, and then lost to Texas State and Texas.
Yeah. So, I mean, you start out 2-2 with 2 kind of iffy wins, and you kind of come into conference and do what they did. To look now where we're at 5-5, I think that's just to be able to say, okay, there was a turnaround, there was a change. And I think as UTSA fans, if I were to tell you after we were 2-2, I'm like, all right, we'll be 5-5 and have a possibility of being bowl eligible. After seeing what we saw at the beginning of the year, I think everyone would be like, no way, you're crazy. But to see them step up the way they have has been a very nice thing to see. And I'm sure all the UTSA fans are really happy to see what we've seen and to be able to have some confidence going into Temple, even going into Army, like to have that confidence. Say you just beat Memphis, who was 7-1. It's not like it's saying it's gonna happen, but the cards aren't off the table now.
No.
Yeah. And I think the big question is now, how do we start off on the right foot from day one next year?
Yeah.
A big detractor to success this year, I think, was penalties. I think we've always had the talent, but penalties alone, right, change our conference performance on by itself.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see what coach has planned to, make sure that's ready to go day one. And I think a lot of the not penalties, the injuries that we're dealing with, some of them happened during the season, but I think a lot of guys that we were waiting on came into the season injured. So moving forward, I mean I feel that's been a perennial issue. So what's going to be the plan to make sure a lot of these stars are good to go day one in the fall?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the penalties, because I don't remember us struggling with this that much in the past. Like, it was always there, but it was never the big talking point. I'm wondering if it's just the amount of guys we have injured, the amount of guys we have that are new to playing, new to starting. Yeah. I'm wondering if that's just a big thing. Is it's a maturity thing? Like, these guys, this is some of their first game action or actual meaningful game action in their time here. And so I'm wondering if it's just solely a maturity thing, that they just needed some time to play and some time to see game action. Because, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of time to practice, but it's going to be totally different once you get into a game setting. And so I'm really curious to know, is that, hey, that's just a young thing where they're just not mature enough, and that this is their first time seeing game action. Like, I'll be interested to see going into next year what that looks like, if they're going to have the same problem, or if now these guys have seen their game action, like, all right, now I know what not to do, what to do, and be able to change that narrative.
Yeah.
I think, previous years, past 4 or 5 years, you had, Frank Harris and Rashad Wisdom were sort of the forefront leaders of the team. And I think you could see them a lot of times on the sidelines and obviously on the field, kind of holding the team together, holding them accountable. Losing those guys, I think it's like, you're almost in a war. You're losing your commanders. You don't really have those guys that are holding you guys tight. And so now you sort of see like Owen starting to rise up to the top. I think that's going to be the real big question going to next year, is going to be who are going to be like the real leaders who are going to take that place, so that when we're on the field, they're holding everyone tight. Because I think at the end of the day, outside of maybe the Texas game, all the games we played were definitely winnable. And I think the team that is currently performing would have been able to win those games. So I think that's a big thing for a lot of the previous games in the first half of the season. It definitely felt like we were basically, taking victory or stealing defeat from the jaws of victory. Like we were like shooting ourselves in the foot. And I guess just the fact that we're in that position, despite all injuries, is just, again, a really, really good hallmark to the coaching of the team and to our overall future.
Yeah. No, it's true 100%. And I mean, I'm looking forward at this Temple game, and I'm like, all right, you just came off of beating UNT, beating Memphis. That you look at this game, and you're like, all right, Temple's not as good as those teams. They're not as competitive as those teams. And so I think you look at it as a fan perspective, and you're like, all right, this is our chance. This is where we're going to go in, and we're going to get our bowl eligibility and be able to play a bowl game in the postseason, which I think, like we said, looking back, that's a very successful season, even if we lose. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very successful season after kind of starting the way we did. And so I'm going to be very interested to see how the team looks coming up this Friday.
Yeah, I think, with any game, you have to worry about it being a trap game. You think back to UNT 3-4 years ago, they were on the hinge for bowl eligibility. Obviously, Temple's beyond that point. But what you have to look out for, I think, is the individual players just trying to lift their draft and portal stock, who still want to make some plays. So I think that's the number one thing to look at. And I think number one, I don't know what his eligibility is. I don't know if he has time to transfer anywhere else or if it's league time for him. But Dante Wright on Temple's team is kind of the sole playmaker for their receiving core. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons that, fans should be bullish as to how this week is going to go, because he kind of, carries the weight. He outperforms our top wide receiver. But the thing to look at is that their receiving yards are pretty much on his shoulders versus ours are kind of split between Willie McCoy, Carpenter, and Houston Thomas.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you look at a lot of those not as great teams in the American, they have that one guy. So the good thing going into that is that you're able to kind of key in on that and know, hey, that's their guy. That's the guy that if they're going to make big plays, that's who it's going to go through. So that's the good thing. But then I agree with you, kind of go out. This team has nothing to lose but to spoil your season. So you look at that and you're like, all right, the scariest thing is a team with nothing to lose. And so, especially now after not having their head coach, they're going to come out and just kind of say, who cares? And they could either come out and say, all right, I'm going to go punch you in the mouth and put up 40, or I'm going to kneel and let you win. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens on Friday.
And a huge shout out to the defense. I know Z Frazier especially. Guy has 4 defensive interceptions this year. I think 2 of them were in the last game. They've been really kind of acting as a buffer for us as we've kind of helped Owen get into that confidence mindset, helping him push forward. And I think, again, this being the Alamodome, if this was at Temple instead, I'd be a little more worried maybe because, again, historically, we for whatever reason struggle a little bit more when we're not playing at home. There's something about the Alamodome. We just seem to perform really, really well that I feel like, this is the one to make a statement win for the season. Whatever happens against Army in the bowl game, is a cherry on top.
No, it's true. I agree. And I think I don't know. I don't know what much else to say. Like, you kind of just have UTSA right now. They're cooking. They're looking really good. And they're either going to go in and punch them in the mouth and put up 50 points, or it's not going to happen. And so I don't know. Like, it's just, you look at it as a UTSA fan and you're like, all right, they're showing me what I want to see. Now let's see if it just keeps going.
Yeah. I think if this is a game where everybody does their job, expect this to be another exhibition game for Owen. These are just 2 very different defenses. We're at 30 sacks for the year, and for the year, Temple's at 13. So I think this is a game to where if the offense just does their job, Owen's going to have the time to make some interesting decisions.
Yeah. And shout out to the equipment room as well. Like, we've been playing in Blackbird uniforms. We're undefeated right now when we're wearing that. Now I know, there's no real stats to that as far as gameplay, but there's got to be something mentally of like, hey, having a new uniform. I know, David, you mentioned a lot in the previous podcast about you say you should definitely dig into like having something unique, similar to like Boise State or Oregon, where it's like, you've got your own kind of recognition of how you guys look and how you guys play. And I think those Blackboard uniforms, man, let's put those out the rest of the season, see what happens.
I think we're undefeated all time in black uniforms, even back in the Wilson days.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said about the look good, feel good, play good. I think I've always thought that way, that if the guys go out and they're confident in what they're wearing, I think they're going to go out and play better. I've thought that since day one, whenever they pull out anything special. Like last year when we pulled out the 2-0 helmets with the like Fiesta stripe on them. Like, I think there's something to be said about when you look good, you feel good, you play good. I don't know what it is, but there's just a confidence factor you have, and you're like, all right, I look good. Now I'm gonna go out there and play good.
What's the look good, feel good fit on the course, David?
Oh man, I wear patterns, man. I be loud. People see me from the other side of the golf course with
skinny John Daly.
Yeah, there's some patterns I have that do look like that, and so yeah, I think you go out there, any sport, any athlete will tell you when you feel like you look good, you're like, all right, now there's a little bit of swagger, there's a little bit of confidence to be played with, and I'm a big fan of the black uniforms. I think they look so clean. The white with the black on the helmet, I just think it looks so good, and obviously they play good in them. So I don't know why you'd go away now.
Yeah, it's like I think another thing is like the past 4 or 5 games. Talked about this with Kalechi, his former player on the last podcast. Is like the last 4 games we've had, they've been all on like ESPN2. Army's going to be on CBS. Temple's going to be on ESPN2. And so there's probably I'm assuming if I was a player, right, knowing that you're going to be on that scale, maybe makes you perform better. I don't know. I know when I'm on Twitter and I'm, making tweets, like the past few games, like you got these huge accounts that are tweeting about UTSA because, we're not on ESPN Plus. We're on a mainstream channel. And so for us to be, I guess, kicking in when we're kicking in right now is a really good feeling. And UNT, I'll say this much about UNT. I do consider them a rival. They're a really good university. They've got a really good ceiling, I think, and not a ceiling that I would view as like, we just beat Rice again. Like Rice, for example, you see a lot of these teams in the EAC that kind of have dead fan bases. Their team accounts will post the wins. They'll get like 1 or 2 comments. And UNT is one of those teams where they have a really rabid fan base. Even with this loss, it was kind of funny before the game. All these accounts were tweeting about how, UTSA is below us. Kind of funny because this is our 4th consecutive win against them, but it's still really, really fun to kind of have these rivalries, these homebrewed rivalries where we're kind of getting back in the groove of things, especially after that loss to Texas State. So, I mean, in the AAC at least, if UNT does end up becoming the new Texas State, I am more than happy to have that be the case.
Yeah, I like that game against UNT because there's always some, I don't know what it is, for some reason, there's always just the trash talk. Like, I feel like with Texas State a little bit just because they're right up the road, but at the same time, like, they're in a different conference. You don't play them all the time. You can't get that feeling of a rivalry game. UNT gives us that because we play them just about every year. And so it gives us that feeling of that rivalry game. And there is because especially after, I think it was UNT who spoiled our undefeated season 3 years ago, would I call it 4 years ago?
Yeah.
When they spoiled our season in that bad weather game. I think since then, UTSA has always had this feeling towards them. And so I like it. I think it's good for the fan bases, good for the teams. And I would like to say UTSA did a really good job containing that quarterback because that quarterback is good. That quarterback for UNT can throw the football. And to be able to contain him the way they did, and then their punt and kick returner as well, I think it's DT, I think is what his name was. He's fast, and that dude can run the football. So be able to contain those guys. And one thing I noticed comparatively to the previous games was that their tackling was a lot better. They were tackling the guy with rallying to the football, tackling the guy wherever he caught it. They weren't giving up those broken tackles where they're missing 3, 4, 5 tackles on one run. They're getting that guy and they're stopping him right there. And I thought that was a really big improvement compared to previous games.
Yeah, I think that was interesting you brought up was that game against UNT, the bad weather game. I mean, before the podcast, Daniel was mentioning how, obviously in the Alamo Dome, right, you're playing in a dome stadium. I think it's 1 of 2 or 1 of 3 outside of Syracuse that play in a dome stadium. We seem to just do really, really well, obviously, in those kind of conditions. And then when we're in kind of like an outside kind of environment, depending on the weather, we seem to kind of struggle. But when the weather is sort of temperate, we seem to perform really well. Like, how do you guys feel that's working out? Because I think one of the things that I guess like I don't really understand is we don't have a dome practice facility. So the guys are obviously practicing outdoors. They're facing the weather. What do you guys think is that differential where for whatever reason, when we're not playing in the Alamo Dome, we're kind of struggling a bit?
What direction is the sun facing in that practice field, versus what they actually see in a game? I'd like to see that because I even just thought now the first bowl game we won was at night. right? So I really want to do the research now, for at least the trailer era, our record in the sunlight, and I don't think it's really good. And this is why, obviously a practice field, the the sort of initial benefit, right, is first bragging rights because they keep making fun of us about over it. But you have that flexibility to work out during the day. I know it's really expensive to go down to the Alamo Dome on short notice. But even if we get that, I hope we don't lose outside practice because I really think they need that. I think they need to be exposed to some sunlight.
The sunlight thing, I think, is a really interesting point because I don't know how much you guys follow the NFL, but back in the early 2000s, the NFL had this. A lot of the players would wear these contact lenses called Nike Maxite, and it was essentially these like red tinted lenses. Contact lenses you put in your eyes, and it would essentially like block a lot of the sunlight that would be coming in, and it had a legitimate like huge effect on receivers and their ability to cast the balls. And so that I think is like a really underrated point. I mean, it got to the point where they had to actually ban them because of how much it was affecting players' performance.
Yeah, I mean, you look at right now the big thing is I'm a Cowboys fan, sadly. And so now that's the whole thing going on with the Cowboys Stadium is the whole windows and sunlight and all this, that, and the third, and these afternoon games when it's coming right through the windows. I don't know. There is something to be said about playing in a dome every home game and not having to bear the elements. And again, you think about even South Texas in general being like it never really gets super, super cold. You get the wind a lot, but not even a ton of rain. You don't get a lot of the elements being down in South Texas as you would up at West Point. And so, yeah, there is something to be said about that. And I think, I don't know. I think that's such an interesting point, but it's like I would need – maybe we come back next week with some stats to prove it or something like that. Because I would need something that shows me that, hey, this is a definitive, this is what's happened at this time, this is what's happened at this time. But then I think at that point as well, you just get really nitpicky where you're just kind of like you try to find reasons. And so I don't know. I think it's an interesting talking point, but I don't know if it has any weight to it.
And then I got to also put credit on like the UTSA fan base that comes to the Alamo Dome. It's the kind of environment where you got like if you got 15, 20,000 of your like most rabid fans, it's going to sound like double or triple the amount of people that would be in any other environment. And that I think is huge for all the players. And that's one of the reasons why like on Twitter and even for those of you guys that are listening to this podcast, like UTSA is that one team I generally believe, even more than like teams like Syracuse, where they're playing in a dome as well. For whatever reason, the acoustics in the Alamo Dome are so good that, like, as I know, A&M obviously we have the fifth man, but dude, I think like in a lot of ways, from a technical perspective, if you really want to think about the individual output a fan can make on a game, like, dude, there's no better place to be than the Alamo Dome.
No, it's true, and I love our UTSA fans. I think they show up and show out every week. Especially now, comparatively to when I was here my freshman year. You get a lot of empty seats in the Alamo Dome. But it's like you said, you get 20,000 in the Alamo Dome. That place gets rocking. And, like, my favorite memory I have was I was at that UTSA UAB game when Oscar caught the tip pass. And then just having – I think there was, like, probably 25, maybe 30,000 people in there at that time. It was so loud. Like, that was the most amazing thing that I'd ever seen. And to be able to have that at UTSA it's a really cool feeling to have.
100%.
Well, Daniel, you got anything else? Final predictions?
Predictions. I'm saying 55-17.
Oh, big win for UTSA. All right, Jeremy, what do you?
I'm going to go a little lower. I'm going maybe 45-12. I think we do really well. I think Temple is going to be – obviously, Temple lost their head coach. They're going to be struggling. They're not really fighting for a bowl game. I think they're probably going to just try to stay healthy and not get injured. But I think also UTSA as well, knowing that, okay, we beat them, we go into the bowl game, obviously facing a ranked Army at West Point, we may pull a little back as well. I hope we don't, because this is one of the things we talked about before is this tendency for UTSA to perform really well in the first half. Second half, we kind of let them run away with it. And if we want to beat Army and go into the bowl game, we can't afford to do that. But I think we're going to do a little bit right here. So I'm going to go a little bit lower there.
All right. I'm going to go with 42-7. I think it'll be I think they're just going to score. I don't think there's going to be any field goals. I think if they're going to score, they're going to score. But I just don't see Temple being able to just hang. I just don't see him being able to hang with how good our defense is playing. I just don't see it happening.
There's just a huge disparity on average. UTSA is at 451 total offense averaging per game, and they're at 207, 307.
Yeah.
So, I think it all comes down to if everybody does their job, you're going to get that kind of gap. Owen's going to have time. The O-line's going to be able to handle it. And the defense is on the other hand is going to be able to get some sacks. I think a lot of guys are going to have an exhibition game. I'm especially excited. I mean, UNT is a good school, is a good team. They've got a great quarterback, and Zay Frazier was able to get 2 interceptions. I'm really excited to see what he does this game.
Yeah, it's true.
One last question I had, I wanted to throw out there before we close up. More AAC type news. A lot of firings happening right now. A lot of firings. I believe there's 5 coaches that have been fired. Charlotte just fired Biff Poggi. Personal favorite guy was, he was an ex, I believe he was like a hedge fund manager. Came in here. I loved his character. The guy would just show up in like this sort of like cut off tees and just doing whatever he wanted to. But obviously, a rough kind of environment to play in. And then FAU ended up, axing Tom Herman, and UTSA has some interesting history with Tom Herman going back to the UH game where we blew open their inaugural stadium, and then East Carolina, Mike Houston, Rice just fired Mike Bloomgren, which is kind of interesting because UTSA, they did beat UTSA, but ended up cutting them. And then Temple, as we mentioned before, just fired Stan Drayton, so they're going to be kind of wiggling around. So UTSA being the place we are, I think going to next year where you're going to have all these teams with a lot of new coaches, we're in a really, really, really good place to kind of cement ourselves.
Yeah, no, it's true. And when you come in, you're going to come into next season with 5 new head coaches at least. And so you're going to come in with a polished team, a team that's seen some action now. I mean, they're poised to do something big next year. And I mean, you just hope that everyone that's here stays, and I hope they bring in some new recruits that are going to be good. And you kind of just look up from here. But again, there's so much uncertainty when it comes to college football that you just never know.
Yeah. I think this coaching carousel in the conference gives us an edge for recruiting this time around. I think it's also interesting to think about how different the situations are. Like UAB is not too far off from their glory days. Neither is FAU, because I mean they had Lane Kiffin go through there. So whatever they're dealing with is very fixable. But you think about Charlotte and Temple, they've had coaches and they've been unable, and Rice too. You can throw them in there. They've been unable to kind of have success as their last couple of coaches. So it'll be interesting to see, especially FAU and UAB. Well, UAB hasn't fired theirs yet. That's just in the talks, right? Yeah. So I mean, FAU. Will they be able to make the right call to get back to where they were, 3-4 seasons ago?
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, all right, guys. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the Meme Nation podcast. We'll catch you guys after Friday against Temple. Peace.
See you guys.
Birds up.